make these very context specific, which we'll look at a little bit later. Okay, everyone clear on Lewis? And we'll move on to adaptive cards. Adaptive cards are the grouping, if we will, to allow us to have a simple to find interface that goes across different channels. And when I say channels, let me back up just a moment. A channel is a way of interacting with the bot. So the channels that we expose, generally people work with bots, are really going to be around things like web chat, which is a control that you can drop into a web page and then make a connection back to the bot and work with it that way. By the same token, there are other channels. So Skype is one, Twilio is one through SMS. We have Kik, we have WeChat, I believe they're working with, and we keep adding these channels over and over again. So Facebook Messenger is another one. Each of these channels has a different set of properties we would use to interact with them, but that abstracts the connection to the user away from the bot developer and allows us much more flexibility to interact with our user. However, because each of these channels is going to have a different way of looking at it, we need kind of a common interface for defining what we're getting or displaying to the user. And that is really around adaptive cards. So adaptive cards, let me try to bring up a site here for that. And I may have to stop sharing this and share that back. Okay, so adaptive cards, as I said, is a tool set that's going to allow us to exchange rich snippets of kind of a native UI, in our case, relative to a bot, but across any of these different channels. And as you can see, the URL for this one is https://adaptivecards.io. And it has a couple pieces in it that are of pretty decent use for us. Number one, I start with the samples to take a look at that. And on the left side, they will have different samples for how we will define these. And these are JSON structures that we can use to define exactly what our card looks like. So in this case, you see an activity update card that's being created. On the JSON is in the center. And then on the right side, we see what that adaptive card will look like in a different context. And if we try to look at it from different ways, I'll go ahead and open this. From a designer perspective, we can see that we changed the host app, which is what we look at there. So that's what it looks like in a web chat. We have it in Cortana Skills. We have it in Microsoft Teams, which is another important channel for us. And you'll see how that card is going to change just a bit as we get the information in, and then we transform it back over to the user. There are a number of different components that we can use. If we look at the Schema Explorer itself, it will tell you all the various elements that we can continue to use. On the right side, it will tell you what version it is available in, because the host is going to be separate from the schema itself, and different hosts and versions have the ability to render it just a little bit differently. So that's going to give you a little more flexibility, but that is driven either by that distinct host, or you can come up with your own custom host to get that information corrected. One of the things that we are currently working on is down at the input level. So if you look on the right here, you'll find information in kind of in the 1.2 that's really around the inline activity, which will tell you what we can do with that. And there's also one at the bottom, which is around requires, which tells us whether or not what it requires. In an earlier version of adaptive cards, they also had a kind of information to say whether or not this was a required field, what the error text would be if you did not fill in that field. So this is an area where it continues to evolve. This will allow us, as we're creating bots, to collect a number of pieces of information at the same time, rather than just continue going back and forth with the user. There are a couple ways of getting information back. The number one way is what we call this application submit, in which case it's going to take all the data and submit it back as a JSON value, which we have to handle slightly differently within our bot as we move forward with that. And that's something we'll discuss as we get into true bot development from a coding standpoint. But I'll make sure we talk about what these concepts explicitly are. So as I said, these are adaptive cards. They show us and give us an interface and a way to define our interface for the user to collect that information and to send it back. If we look at our virtual assistant that we're creating for the health bot, that first information we get in that welcome card is in fact an adaptive card that we can then customize to do different pieces in different environments, whether it's a picture, whether there are links that we want to work with that. So that's an example of us already using the adaptive cards. And in most of the samples on Bot Builder, they're going to give you that as a starting point, although they don't typically explain what that is or how we then go about using that. But that's something we can certainly go into at a deeper level. So, all right, let's go back to our outline here. All right. So when I say the term OAuth, is anyone familiar with OAuth?
It's a type of authentication method of login.
That's correct. So it is a method of doing authentication. Some people say authorization as well. I do not. The difference being authentication being who are you, as opposed to authorization or what can you do. But we'll look at that in the context of a bot. So typically within a bot, once we gain access to a particular set of resources, we will need to authenticate. Within our bot framework, we have chosen OAuth as that standard. It gives us much more flexibility to integrate with third-party providers other than Azure Active Directory. And that's going to allow us to get that additional flexibility, not just for us within Microsoft, but out within our customer base as well. Say if they have their own internal authentication service through Okta or something of that nature, we would be able to integrate with that just via the OAuth setting that we would add upon that bot. It also allows us, in the case of us integrating with Active Directory, to lock it down to a particular Active Directory tenant by specifying that tenant ID, or if we want to allow both organizational accounts from Microsoft, as well as the generic personal accounts, the Microsoft accounts, we can use the word common as the tenant ID, and that will allow us to get both of those to authenticate against as from a service perspective, and then we can go from there. One of the other benefits of that is when you specify your OAuth settings, you also get that consent prompt, which is important for our users to see exactly what we are attempting to ask them for access for, because OAuth involves what we call scopes. So a scope could be read, in which we are getting the information about that user's profile. It could be mail read, which will allow us to access to their inbox, all the way to mail write, and a couple other properties that allow us to also impersonate them, which would allow us to get to other places like Dynamics, to their calendar, and all sorts of other abilities using the Graph API. So that's why OAuth is important to us, and for us to understand how we're getting that information in, how are we accessing it, and then what are we doing that from a consent standpoint from the user. All right, so from a bot specific side, we talked a bit about channels, which are the methods we use from the bot to the user. One of the ones that we haven't talked as much about is a completely voice channel. We have just now introduced more of a direct line speech, which is allowing us to do custom wake words. When we think about some of the smart speakers at home, using the various wake words, which may be Alexa or Google or Echo in my home's case, but to specify our own custom wake words for this interaction with this channel, which will then begin taking the information from the user, converting that from audio effective to text, and sending that over to us so that we interact with it within our bot as though it was basic text. So that's one of the benefits of those channels, which is no matter what it was on the back end from that user itself, we can still interact with it as though it is simple text and then operate from there. Now, what that does preclude us from doing a bit is doing one of the requirements that I had recently, which is to be able to do voice authentication, right? Since we're only getting the text, we won't have that capability directly, but there are some workarounds that we can use in order to get that. But that's really around the channel and how it's converting the information from the user into text that we can then use. Okay. We talked a bit about a turn, which is the concept of the user giving us information and then we responding back. So that simple in and out request response model, that is what we call a turn. So when we talk about a single turn versus multi-turn, we are specifically talking about was all the information passed for us to do a job in a single set of information coming in? Or is there a back and forth that goes along with that in order to get that done? So those groupings can be grouped in what we call a dialogue. And a dialogue is a set of operations, request and response. We can, of course, nest these over and over so that we can get information in different ways. If we have a 6-step process, we can do what we call as a waterfall and say, okay, step 1, prompt them for their name. Step number 2, process that name, store it somewhere if we want to. Step 3, ask them their age. Then step 4, process their age. Those are the kind of things that we talk about into a dialogue, right? And a dialogue may have an input and it may also have a result. And as we're going through each of these waterfall steps, we have a step context that we can use that will have the information in addition to the options which were passed into the overall dialogue. So I'm throwing a bunch of information at you right now. And when we look at the code, we will isolate what each of those is and how those work. Now, notice I did not use the word conversation. I did not use the word conversation because conversation means something different to us. Conversation to us is the wrapping of all of the responses back and forth, single turn, multi-turn, for an entire interaction with a bot. If you open up a web page with a bot on it and you start having a discussion back and forth with it, and then you open up a second web browser and then connect back to that bot, you have at that point 2 independent conversations going on. Information you're putting into the first conversation will not necessarily transfer over to that second conversation. So those are completely separate. That's why we make a distinction between the word conversation, the word dialogue, and then the word turn, because those are completely different concepts that we need to consider, especially as we move into some of the newer tools that I'll talk about at the end of this. Okay, we talk about prompts, and prompts are the way that we get information back from the user. So if we did something to say, please state your name, and then wait for a response back, we would do that with a prompt. So a prompt has options and it also has a type, which kind of constrains the data that we're really looking for. A prompt also has a validator that we can attach to it to determine what we're going to do with that information as we accept it, or if we want to retry or reprompt that. And our technology has evolved over the last number of months to decide how we go about getting that information in and how we are working back up the business level to help them define some of that information as well. Okay, so prompts, as I said, are what we allow people to use. The most commonly ones are text prompts, number prompts, choice prompts, because those will allow us in general to get the types of information we want to get from users in those cases. There is also what we call a sign-in card, which works back with OAuth to allow us to get the information to authenticate that user and then use their token at that point to do other things within our system. So all these are the high-level concepts that we need to understand. And then we'll look at some of the tools that we'll have at our disposal in order to interact with the bot.